family's been in the area. I think we're talking about Myra Falls, and I think my grandparents were there before they were married in a rowboat in the early 20s, to give you an idea. They came up from Comox with a chaperone, and they rode down there to go see because her name was Myra. So they wanted to go to Myra Falls and see this waterfall down the end of Buttle Lake.
When the miners first went in, they didn't go in with a sense of wanting to cooperate with anything or anyone.
I've grown up knowing lots about the mine and things because it was always here and we had connections to it, and I can remember that they were early days. They didn't even have a road to the mine, so they were doing some early stuff in the 60s there just by going down the lake in a barge. And so I just recalled as little kids, that was going on.
There was quite an evolution from the time that happened in 1959 to 60 years later. And it wasn't until the 70s that it became an outdoor education center.
And then building the road to actually open up the mine at a different scale. So the mine actually, I think, was behind the road construction and getting the permission of that. And at that time, in the 60s, it was, any economic development was a good thing for government. They loved their tax base and stuff. So mines got permission even in the middle of an original park. Strathcona Park is actually the first provincial park. And it was, supposed to be modeled after Little Banff and be a real tourism success was the dream when it was put together in, 1910, I think it was, when they got the act to put this park together. So kind of interesting that you think about that, but it really wasn't a big battle because that went on all the time. I think the flooding of the reservoir was a bigger environmental issue for my father and Hig Brown, Roger K. Brown, a famous guy in Campbell River and things. My grandfather's thing, they wouldn't want to affect the fish, so he actually took on the job being an alderman, and then they volunteered to the job of actually going down and doing water samples like once a month. He'd go down with a little tin boat and go out and drop a thing down, and then they started monitoring the worries that, okay, a mine's in here, that what's going to actually happen to the water quality. I don't know if the mine, in those early days, they just, who knows what kind of scale, and I don't think they really even guessed that it would be much of a concern. People were in hard rock mining and gold panning and didn't really think of the environmental impact of mining in those early days. So I don't think, relative to big clear-cut logging was more of a big thing and might damage the fish in those days. Little do they know that some of these things came on. My name is Jamie Boulding, and I'm from Strathcona Park Lodge, where I'm the president here. And this is a family business that was started more than 60 years ago. And so it's been in my family my whole life. So, I've taken over management over the last 30 years. So it is kind of a long family history. And it's kind of cool that we're talking about this because we have a long family connection to this part of the world, even before we had this resort outdoor education center called Strathcona Park Lodge here it's been our family thing. The history of actually this outdoor education center resort group here, my parents are Jim Boulding and Myra Boulding. It was actually Myrna Bakey at one time as a local Campbell River name.
Myrna and her husband Jim first got into the business of running the lodge back in 1959. It was a brand new building. It was just one building that her father Wallace had procured when the lake, Upper Campbell Lake, was flooded. When the last dam went in. They didn't plan to have an outdoor education center. They wanted to start a boys' camp. They were both teachers in Campbell River, but it didn't turn out to be a very popular idea. But she said that as people were driving along the road and heading out towards the park or Gold River, they would stop and say, hey, can we stay here for the night? Because it used to be a tourist lodge before it went on to their property.
They had this dream come out of school that they would get something started. My father took some courses in phys ed and rec and thought a summer camp would be interesting. And my mother, and more of the practical, and she had a home economics and foods background and stuff, and maybe a resort thing. So it evolved even from its opening in 1959 to being a little bit like that we did outdoor things, and we had resort and cabins and things, and Some of my grandfather's old logging camp cabins are still here on site from his bunkhouses that were moved around as the small logging outfit that they were in the area, the Bakey brothers. So it's kind of an interesting, how it ended up in this particular spot is all to do with the logging of the reservoir. Where we are right now, we're on the same lake as Myra Falls Mine, and the lake is actually called Upper Campbell and Buttle Lake. There's two lakes that are actually all the same level because they're actually controlled by a dam that was built in 1958. So they flooded this thing, and what they actually did is they took an existing lake that was almost 5 miles long, Upper Campbell Lake, and they flooded it back into Buttle Lake. So it's all one lake behind a dam that's almost 100 meters tall. So it's a birth-fill dam, a large one, which is BC Hydro is doing a lot of money on coming up in the next 10, 20 years to try to make it much more sizably capable for all the challenges. But it's a big reservoir, and there was a big environmental battle at the time because if you know what environmental history of these things, some of the early reservoirs in BC, they wouldn't even go to the trouble of cutting the trees down. They would just actually flood it. The park was certainly first for most of the major stuff, but the claims were done. There was mines pre-park. They up in the Bedwell and stuff at the south end of the park. They were mining there like, pre-park in the early 1900 or something. So they were climbing up mountains and digging holes and things, and small scale, but unbelievably hard work. Just some of the things that they did on top of the mountains, you think, what the heck, eh?
History of the mine where it is, it's a very sensitive place. It's in the middle of Strathcona Park, and Strathcona Park is a Class A park for British Columbia. It's the oldest park in the province, and it's pretty much one of the most pristine ones too. So it's really strange to have this mine operating in the park. If you understand the way that the Parks Act is, you don't do any of this sort of stuff in a park. So the conditions must have been right at the time, and they were able to set up a park within the park. So the Westman, forget the actual name, but it has its own park designation. There's a lot of rules around it, and at the end of the day, it's supposed to be returned to its natural state when the mine closes. A lot of complications there because there's been some excavation at the surface level. That's kind of hard to repair those scars on the land. Most of the operation is underground, so most people have no idea what's going on up there.
That claim factor is an interesting one, and it gets, there is a big history of this relative to, there was some other state claims, and it's a great story in itself. The whole cream silver thing that went on in '86. So it's adjacent to the mine, and they obviously, they're miners too, but they were a separate outfit. And they had claims in this alpine area that they hoped to get in there and hard rock mine under Cream Lake. It was an interesting thing, of course, that they wanted to open a new mine in that time in the 80s, and people at that point, I think, it became a big battle for people because I don't think the public really knew that it was legal still to do forestry and mining and things in parks if you got the right permission, right? And because they have mineral claims, the Mineral Act was pretty strong about saying you do it anytime, anywhere, even under someone's private property in a perfect spot, which is a problematic Original Mines Act, and I think they're going to have to come to terms with. But at the time, it was one of the first real environmental battles, especially with a win, really, for the environmentalists. So it's a very fascinating bit of a study. If you wanted to do a whole movie about that, is that they actually, I think the public opinion was very quickly swayed in the environmentalist factor because people really, they're mining in the middle of a park. Does that go on? And they're going to have a new mine. And some not very smart parks ministers said, oh, it's an area of low park value. And they said that when the park brochure had a picture of Cream Silver or of Cream Lake on it as being a more scenic spot in the park. So the place they were going to mine happened to be the cover picture. We were very much involved. But in a business, I think even in that time, you had to be a little bit careful. So really, we knew all the people involved, and they did have meetings here. We supported them with food and support and things, but we were careful not to be official endorsers, and it was our protest. So there's a group called the Friends of Strathcona Park that was the main player that organized, and they did a tremendous job. And a few of these people that were the original people that got together and said, we do this. And it's interesting, my father was dying at the time too, so he was, it was one of his pet things that he, passed on this battle to them and things. So it was kind of interesting in that sort of historical area.
Jim was still alive. Unfortunately, he passed away in '86. He had cancer, so he didn't see the Friends of Strathcona come to fruition.
He was certainly passionate about some early and environmental battles, which are just so tough, They took their mine waste at that time. They ground up and got they did cold water, sort of not smelting, but grinding it up and just floating stuff off. So that waste actually was put in Battle Lake. And that was this easy way to get rid of the material. They just piped it down there and dumped it in the lake, and it would just settle to the bottom. So that sounds pretty scary in itself.
The Strathcona Park Public Advisory Committee was formed, and they have kept on top of what's going on at the mine, so there's lots of communication today. And the mine can't expand or make any changes without consulting with them, and of course the Ministry of Mines is involved. But I would say that in the beginning, no, there wasn't much thought about how this would impact the community other than, hey, we're bringing you jobs.
As you hear the history of mining and all these sort of dealing with tailings and mine waste, that becomes where the problem is. It's probably the biggest thing is what do you do with it afterwards? How do you remediate it? How do you deal with all the disturbed ground and how that might, for a long term, be a problem? And certainly in our area, there's been, when the price cap comes back, there's a little copper mine on Mount Washington that's local and things, and I can't believe, I think that the Feds have already paid $100 million in remediation up there.
In the 90s, there were companies that owned the Myra Falls operation, like Westman, Boulding. It changed hands several times, who recognized that it was a good idea to have some kind of engagement with the community. And they developed tours of the mine that you could take, and I think these ended in about 2003.
What the mine used to do years ago was they would basically, actually just on the other side of this building where that mall is, it used to be a giant field at one time. And they would set up giant boulders, and so we could do different things, drilling competitions. They had all the different types of competitions. They would have, well, you also got good old gold ingots.
I think community relationships are pretty important, right? So you can have disagreements, it's like politics and things, but it ties all back into a thought that, I think we have to be very conscious that mining is a much bigger environmental footprint than we think on Earth nowadays, and we should be doing a tremendous job on recycling and maybe not adding a bunch more stuff, because everything we do is not easy and has an impact. And in this case, it's quite studied because it's in the park and because it's caused a bit of uproar at times. I think people are quite conscious of this particular mine, so they've tried to do a good job.
But we had one mine manager that actually joined the Strathcona Lodge group to help them out, and he said, I don't want to be part of the problem, I want to be part of your solutions. So, yeah, we actually wanted to bring in a power line at one time up the lake, but they put a stop to that. Well, the mine has its own power supply. They have two hydro dams. So the plan was, if we could get onto the grid, then, because what happens is, in the fall, we get short of water in certain times. So the thought would be, we can feed off the grid then, and then we can feed back into the grid in the winter months. But yeah, it never happened. Yeah, it's a shame. But no, the mine and the park have worked well together.
So we obviously are worried here too that the long term, that they're going to keep up and do a good job on anything that might be affected. And they, power to them, the mine people, we have a great relationship with the local guys in the mine for 60 years here.
But from my standpoint, as a union person, I've never seen any conflict. And we're so strictly regulated there by the ministry, we can't really do anything to piss anybody off, or we're going to be shut down. So we have a lot of safeguards in place to make sure that there's no spills and stuff like that.
The fact that there's not a lot of knowledge about the mine isn't, I'd say it's probably somewhat by design, that because of where the mine is and the sensitivity of it being in the park, there's an element of society that doesn't want it there.
A lot of people within the community of Campbell River all eventually wind up working in the mine at some time or another. When I first hired on, there was about 700 employees.
We were always aware that Big Brother's always watching. And you do something bad in the park, somebody's going to notice it, and it's going to get out type thing. And you're going to have either local environmental groups that are concerned about you being there and want to make sure you're doing it right, all the way up to the government.
You're going to have to work together. You're going to have to realize that all your decisions impact everyone else. And I think we're missing that. And I think that outdoor education and the impact Strathcona has that's some of our richest, most important, and so necessary in society. It gets even more and more necessary. The Campbell River Museum is really award-winning and done some beautiful shows, sort of looking at these things. It's fascinating and beautiful history of the areas and things. So, you know, mining would just be one of them, sort of the history of mining in Vancouver Island. It's kind of interesting. What we're most passionate about here is making a difference, because that's the reward. The intrinsic reward is saying you're actually hopefully making the world a better place and informing people.
If you break the rules and you don't follow them properly, bad things can happen.
We are justifiably worried, and I think everyone should be, that how it's going to be done in the long term. Sometimes if the public really knows, it might make a difference. They care.